By the end of this week, the celebration of Passover will begin. It is a time when Jesus and the Jewish people remember and observe God's foundational act of deliverance from the slavery of their Hebrew ancestors in Egypt. Now think about that. Every year at this time, Jewish people retell the stories of how God liberated an oppressed people from the domination of an ancient, brutal empire who were dominating the Jewish people, and whose pharaohs believed that they were living gods. It is not difficult, then, to see how and why there were always tensions years later in Jerusalem around the time of Passover. When Jesus lived, it was not the Egyptians, it was the Roman Empire that brutally dominated the Jewish people. And their emperors believed that they were living gods. They would tell each other, "Caesar is Lord." They engraved it on their coins. "Caesar Augustus, divine Son of God, Caesar is Lord." And so plenty of people had desires and designs on overthrowing the Roman rule in their homeland. Insurgents, like a man named Barabbas, who we will encounter later this week. Call him a terrorist, as Pilate did, or call him a freedom fighter. It depends on your perspective. Barabbas was just one of many nationalists among Jesus' people who led small yet violent rebellions in the streets of Jerusalem. Because celebrating liberation from oppression at Passover meant that the Roman authorities kept a close watch and a tight lid on things in Jerusalem in those days. So here's the very interesting image for us on Palm Sunday. By this time, the Roman authority in Jesus' homeland was a governor, Pontius Pilate. And he lived in a large, modern, and beautiful city on the coast, Caesarea Maritima. Can't say as I blame him living on the beach. It was no longer that he lived in Jerusalem, though a previous Roman named Herod had built quite a palace in that city years before. For the major Jewish festivals, and especially at Passover, Pontius Pilate, like those who came before him and those who would come after him, went to Jerusalem in a large imperial procession. Pilate rode at the head of a column of imperial cavalry and soldiers. This was a visual proclamation of the power of his empire. And they came from the west to Jerusalem in order to reinforce the Roman garrison permanently stationed at a fortress overlooking the temple courtyard. But this year, coming from the east, was another sort of procession entirely, wasn't it? When a band of peasants rode down from the Mount of Olives with Jesus riding on a donkey. Jesus was from the peasant village of Nazareth in Galilee. His followers came from surrounding peasant villages. And his message to them and to everyone was about the kingdom of God. And it stood in utter contrast to the values and practices, the violence and domination of the Roman Empire. Everything about it was different. You might imagine the contrast between these two processions, one from the west, one from the east, as one of those old Soviet military parades in Moscow. You remember? Compared to the Civil Rights March in Selma, Alabama. The two parades entering Jerusalem at that time could not have been more different than each other. And I might also highlight the danger that Jesus knew he was getting into by going to Jerusalem at all. That week he stood in the temple courtyard with one of those Roman coins and said, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but give to God what belongs to God." Remember? What do you think that meant? Because to be Jewish was to know the Psalms, which also said, "The earth is the Lord's and everything that dwells within it, the world and all of those who dwell upon it." I mean, to be Jewish was to know that every single thing belongs to God. And Jesus says to give to God what belongs to God. The implication? Ain't nothing belongs to Caesar. One of his peasant followers, upon gazing at the beautiful city of Jerusalem, said, "Look at these magnificent buildings. And look at the impressive stones used to build the walls here." I mean, it's like a kid from the country on his first field trip to New York City. Herod used extremely large stones, some believed to be 160,000 pounds. It's a big rock. And Jesus said, "Yes, look at them. And I tell you, not one of these stones will be left standing. Every single one will be thrown down." Which sounds, if you will, something like a violent threat to destroy the temple. It sounds like the kind of thing that an insurgent against Rome with a small following might try to accomplish during Passover if they could just get enough people to support them. And so when Jesus entered the courtyard of that temple, turning over the tables of the money changers and those who sold birds for sacrifice, you might then be reminded of the kind of demonstration Jeremiah or other prophets would do in that same place. He was symbolically destroying the temple. And that is what Jim Croce once sang about, if you remember. You don't tug on Superman's cape. The case against Jesus as a potential threat to the public order in Jerusalem was set, so that he should be executed like all those others who dared to disturb the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. It should be said that Jesus was not making a statement against his own Jewish faith and the ways that God was worshiped in Jerusalem. Along with a great deal of other faithful Jews, Jesus saw the corruption of the current high priesthood and how they were basically instruments of this Roman Empire as corruption to be overcome. An entire sect of Judaism protested this very thing by leaving Jerusalem and going and setting up a private community along the coast of the Dead Sea, the Essenes. They believed that the corruption in that temple made its current worship invalid altogether. Not because Judaism was wrong, but because the faith that Jesus grew up with was deeply true about the God of the universe. It was just no longer being represented faithfully in Jerusalem in those days. Now, the ways Jesus did this were different than those folks at the Dead Sea. Instead of the temple being the place where God could forgive sins through sacrifice, Jesus forgave sins wherever he was, which is a little protest about the ways things were in Jerusalem those days. But certain religious people didn't like what he did either. But when he rode into town on a donkey, Jesus was deliberately demonstrating that the real empire, the true empire, the kingdom of God, was proclaiming judgment on a wicked, corrupt, and violent power that was there destroying God's very earth and its people. And within 5 days, they conspired and colluded to crucify him. We've spent the past 6 weeks of this Lenten season together studying the last words of Jesus from the cross where he died. And I thought that we should put it in context for this day, Palm Sunday. But now I invite you to turn to these second to the last words as they are found in John's Gospel. A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. What do we make, by the way, of the importance of Jesus' last words on the cross? Not every human life ends with the opportunity to speak what needs to be said. But sometimes it happens so. Death is certain, but the one who is dying has maintained her ability to think clearly and to speak. And such is the way that Jesus' followers have told us that he died. What do we make of what he said then? How important must these things be to us? Outside of a room at the hospital where a woman close to her own end was inside, I overheard such a sacred conversation once. She had asked that her sons come in to see her and to be with her in that place. And so these two men who were about my age went in, and I waited as their pastor outside. and I could only hear the muffled sounds of conversation inside, but when the two sons came out later, having said a final goodbye, one of them said, "I have got to get my life turned around." "What did she say to you?" I asked. "She said that she loves me no matter what, and that she believes in me." How important was that? For this man, it was the beginning of an important journey towards faith, towards health, towards reconciliation, towards life for him. That's how important his mother's dying words were. They saved his life. And so we together have listened to the dying words of Jesus with the same sort of anticipation and intensity. We know it matters what he chose to say. And close to the very end, he offered us this: "It is finished." I am always hesitant to ever skip over Good Friday and start proclaiming the resurrection of Easter. There is something vital for us to survey the wondrous cross, as the old hymn tells us. There is something about sitting with the crucifixion long enough to understand it. But the reality for us as Christians is that you and I are always resurrection people. We are always Easter people, aware of victory over death. And on so many levels, it is hard for us to look at the cross by itself and truly see it as it is finished. Isn't it? Resurrection is the very beginning of something entirely new and blessed. And we live in that even when we are journeying each year through Lent and then Holy Week into Good Friday with its dying on the cross. We still know that we are resurrection people. Jesus meant something that we have to work at in order to understand. When he says it is finished. His life here on earth, his divinely given mission, his healings, his teachings, it is finished. So you might hear him saying that all has been accomplished that he set out to be and to do on God's behalf. It is all now contained here in completeness. Remember, however, that he has expressly come to this corrupted holy city of Jerusalem to judge the world as it is, governed by violent, selfish, dominating powers who have even taken control of God's place of worship. Some would even describe these things with the poetry of an apocalypse. Empires as demonic and horned beasts, always under the control of and becoming expressions of the very spiritual powers opposed to God. How does Jesus demonstrate the exact opposite of that? Jesus is willing to die for the very way of living that He has from the beginning proclaimed to us as the way. He is willing to die for it rather than to violently subdue it and its demonic alternative. What did the Apostle Paul once write to the Romans? Do not repay anyone evil for evil. But why? Because if you resist evil in the ways that it comes to you, you only become the very thing you are resisting. So Paul ends up saying, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Or as Martin Luther King Jr. famously put it, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hatred cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And hence we see the cross of Jesus in its love and in its light. What is finished then is the final picture that Jesus can paint for us, depicting who God is and what God is truly like. God is light, and God is love. And God judges the sinful ways of the world by allowing it to crucify the pure light of Jesus. We are aware, of course, that there will be vindication. But for today and beyond, for Jesus to say that it is finished is also to hear a resounding call upon you and upon me, upon all of us together. It is now up to you. And as we gaze at His procession of palms today, the question is put to us in this way: which side of Jerusalem are you on? Are you coming from the west in an imperial march? Or are you coming from the east with a humble donkey? Which parade will we march with?